down on one knee, and said to her, "Princess, the king awaits you." The princess was surprised, and, if the truth must be told, very much delighted at the appearance of this charming page, whom she could not remember to have seen before. Thinking he might belong to the household of the duchess, she said, "How long have you been one of the king's pages?" "I am not in service of the king, madam," answered he, "but in yours." "In mine?" said the princess, with great surprise. "Then how is it that I have never seen you before?" "Ah, princess," said he, "I have never dared to present myself to you; but now the king's marriage threatens you with so many dangers, that I have resolved to tell you at once how much I love you already, and I trust that in time I may win your regard. I am Prince Percinet, of whose riches you may have heard, and whose fairy gift will, I hope, be of use to you in all your difficulties, if you will permit me to accompany you under this disguise." "Ah, Percinet," cried the princess, "is it really you? I have so often heard of you, and wished to see you. If you will indeed be my friend, I shall not be afraid of that wicked old duchess any more." So they went back to the palace together, and there Graciosa found a beautiful horse, which Percinet had brought for her to ride. As it was very spirited, he led it by the bridle, and this arrangement enabled him to turn and look at the princess often, which he did not fail to do. Indeed, she was so pretty that it was a real pleasure to look at her. When the horse which the duchess was to ride appeared beside Graciosa's, it looked no better than an old cart horse, and as to their trappings, there was simply no comparison between them, as the princess's saddle and bridle were one glittering mass of diamonds. The king had so many other things to think of that he did not notice this, but all his courtiers were entirely taken up with admiring the princess and her charming page in green, who was more handsome and distinguished looking than all the rest of the court put together. When they met the Duchess Grumbly, she was seated in an open carriage, trying in vain to look dignified. The king and the princess saluted her, and her horse was brought forward for her to mount; but when she saw Graciosa's, she cried angrily, "If that child is to have a better horse than mine, I will go back to my own castle this very minute. What is the good of being a queen if one is to be slighted like this?" Upon this the king commanded Graciosa to dismount, and to beg the duchess to honour her by mounting her horse. The princess obeyed in silence, and the duchess, without looking at her or thanking her, scrambled up upon the beautiful horse, where she sat looking like a bundle of clothes, and 8 officers had to hold her up for fear she would fall off. Even then she was not satisfied, and was still grumbling and muttering, so they asked her what was the matter. "I wish that page in green to come and lead the horse, as he did when Graciosa rode it," she said very sharply. And the king ordered the page to come and lead the queen's horse. Percinet and the princess looked at one another, but said never a word; and then he did as the king commanded, and the procession started in great pomp. The duchess was greatly elated, and as she sat there in state would not have wished to change places even with Graciosa. But at the moment when it was least expected, the beautiful horse began to plunge and rear and kick, and finally to run away at such a pace that it was impossible to stop him. At first the duchess clung to the saddle, but she was very soon thrown off, and fell in a heap among the stones and thorns, and there they found her, shaken to a jelly, and collected what was left of her as if she had been a broken glass. Her bonnet was here, and her shoes were there, her face was scratched, and her fine clothes were covered in mud. Never was a bride seen in such a dismal plight. They carried her back to the palace, and put her to bed, but as soon as she recovered enough to be able to speak, she began to scold and rage, and declared that the whole affair was Graciosa's fault, that she had contrived it on purpose to try and get rid of her, and that if the king would not have her punished, she would go back to her castle and enjoy her riches by herself. At this the king was terribly frightened, for he did not at all want to lose all those barrels of gold and jewels, so he hastened to appease the duchess, and told her she might punish Graciosa in any way she pleased. Thereupon she sent for Graciosa, who turned pale and trembled at the summons, for she guessed that it promised nothing agreeable for her. She looked all about for Percinet, but he was nowhere to be seen. So she had no choice but to go to the Duchess Grumbly's room. She had hardly got inside the door when she was seized by 4 waiting women, who looked so tall and strong and cruel that the princess shuddered at the sight of them, and still more when she saw them arming themselves with great bundles of rods, and heard the duchess call out to them from her bed to beat the princess without mercy. Poor Graciosa wished miserably that Percinet could only know what was happening, and come to rescue her. But no sooner did they begin to beat her than she found, to her great relief, that the rods had changed to bundles of peacock's feathers. And though the duchess's women went on until they were so tired they could no longer raise their arms from their sides, yet she was not hurt in the least. However, the duchess thought she must be black and blue after such a beating, so Graciosa, when she was released, pretended to feel very ill, and went away into her own room, where she told her nurse all that had happened. And then the nurse left her, and when the princess turned round, there stood Percinet beside her. She thanked him gratefully for helping her so cleverly, and they laughed and were very merry over the way they had taken in the duchess and her waiting maids. But Percinet advised her still to pretend to be ill for a few days, and after promising to come to her aid whenever she needed him, he disappeared as suddenly as he had come. The duchess was so delighted at the idea that Graciosa was really ill, that she herself recovered twice as fast as she would have done otherwise, and the wedding was held with great magnificence. Now, as the king knew that, above all other things, the queen loved to be told that she was beautiful, he ordered that her portrait should be painted, and that a tournament should be held, at which all the bravest knights of his court should maintain against all comers that Grumbly was the most beautiful princess in the world. Numbers of knights came from far and wide to accept the challenge, and the hideous queen sat in great state in a balcony hung with cloth of gold to watch the contests, and Graciosa had to stand up beside her, where her loveliness was so conspicuous that the combatants could not keep their eyes off her. But the queen was so vain that she thought all their admiring glances were for herself, especially as, in spite of all the badness of their cause, the king's knights were so brave that they were the victors in every combat. However, when nearly all the strangers had been defeated, a young unknown knight presented himself. He carried a portrait enclosed in a box encrusted with diamonds, and he declared himself willing to maintain against them all that the queen was the ugliest creature in the world, and that the princess whose portrait he carried was the most beautiful. So one by one knights came out against him.